right, I'd like to welcome everybody to the afternoon session for the Black Communities Conference, Day 3. We are here to have a conversation with Shanette Garrett Scott, who is an associate professor of history at the University of Mississippi, Ole Miss. And we are here to talk about her fabulous book that you can see I've been I've been obviously making good use of, called Banking on Freedom: Black Women in U.S. Finance Before the New Deal. And I just want to mention, by way of starting, that this book has garnered quite a few awards. Congratulations. It's won the Bennett H. Wall Award for the Southern Historical Association, the Letitia Woods Brown Book Prize for the Association of Black Women Historians, and also the Darlene Clark Hine Award for the Organization of American Historians, as well as being as well as being shortlisted for the 2020 Hagley Prize of the Hagley Museum and Business History Conference. So congratulations, that's really fabulous and obviously well-deserved. It's a fabulous book and it's really gotten great attention. We're really honored that you were able to join us today, and we have so much to talk about it. Mark has been plugging the book ever since yesterday in the conversation. So we're both really excited to be able to join you and talk about the book.
I'm excited too.
Great. Just, by way of starting, you really start very interestingly in the book telling us your story connected to finance and the finance industry. So why don't you begin just there, telling us about your background that I assume piqued your interest in this topic for the book.
Mhm. Actually, to be honest, for the longest, I didn't think that what I did for my career for over 10 years had anything to do with this book. So I spent 10 years working in the real estate and mortgage industry. I had gone to college as a young person and dropped out to have family. And so I found myself working in the mortgage business. And I found myself working for one of the earliest companies that kind of pioneered these kind of high risk subprime mortgages. And in the book, I mentioned that one day, after, months, years and years of working, 50, 60, 70 plus hours a week, bringing my family, to work on the weekends, feeling that I was working together, pulling together with everyone in our organization to help people, get into homes. My boss just exclaimed, Shanette, you are going to make me a millionaire. And I thought to myself, no, I'm not. No, I'm not. And for some reason, that statement really helped me to realize, one, how hard I was working, but also that I was really seeing so many other people being enriched by these some of which were really sometimes kind of shady loans. And I just resolved to follow my own dreams. And so when I got into graduate school and I knew I wanted to work on Black women in business, at first I worked on insurance and a little bit of banking. So unfortunately, the subprime mortgage crisis kind of had a fortuitous effect too. The Consolidated Bank and Trust, which was originally the St. Luke Bank, actually closed in 2013 because of the subprime crisis. But that also meant that its records became available. And so I jumped at the opportunity to tell a kind of deeper story about the bank and the women that ran it. And in the process, I discovered, kind of myself.
Right, right. And that often, I can relate to that because I think that often happens. We don't always see ourselves in it. But actually, a friend of mine, another academic friend of mine, said, all work, all writings are autobiographical, whether we realize it or not in some fashion. So the book, the subtitle, Black Women in the U.S. Finance Before the New Deal. So you start with the post-emancipation period, immediate post-emancipation period, and you take us all the way to the early decades of the 20th century, Black women's engagement with finance during that time, with finance institutions. During the post-emancipation period, what are we seeing during that time? What are the financial institutions that Black women are interacting with, and what's that experience like?
Mhm, mhm. So the book really features the Freedmen's Bank, and I think that it really kind of centers what happens after the failure of the Freedmen's Bank and how that shapes and influences women's decisions about how to take control of their economic lives. But it also looks at the period during the Civil War through Reconstruction, because it traces the roots of the Freedmen's Bank in these kinds of experiments that were going on during the Civil War. So you had white, Northern philanthropists and these aid society folks, and also Union military officers who somehow convinced themselves that enslaved people who had spent, centuries enriching this country through their labor, somehow now that freedom stood before them, that somehow they needed to be forced to work, and they needed to be taught a work ethic and the importance of thrift and saving money. Of course, completely ignoring, African Americans' long, involvement in the market and using credit, and even banks, even enslaved people, were conversant with banking. And so with the Freedmen's Bank, I really did try to, show how African American women, even though that bank was created not with them or their interests in mind, that they still were able to wrest some kind of utility out of it. And the other point that I really try to make in that, early chapter is that Black women folded the Freedmen's Bank into their existing networks. And those networks included secret societies, mutual aid societies, church societies, revolving credit associations, which we sometimes call SUSUs now. But African American women had long been, during enslavement and after, because they always had to work. And so they always had to manage money. Even freed women, women who were freed during enslavement, had to, be economically savvy, because if they ever fell on hard times or had to resort to charity, they could be sold back into slavery. So African American women always, understood the importance of controlling their financial lives, and they used their resources not just to support their families, but also to support their communities. So the Freedmen's Bank, in all of its kind of exploitative interactions with Black women still were able to use it, but they used it right alongside their other financial networks to do the things that they had always done: take care of their families, build schools, educate their children, buy homes, start businesses. So Black women have always had a really, their enterprise and economic sense of economic justice has always been really, acute.
Yeah.
One of the things that I was really struck by are some of the similarities between now and then some of the things that are different, and the role of the power and the role of networking, and the ability to connect with people was highly sought after, and then these secret societies. And so maybe just because that, I mean, the role of these society groups that many oftentimes came out of the church, out of the Black church, but then there's like an evolution of all these, this organization came out of this organization, came out of this organization, and just talk a little bit about what it was like in, I guess, after the antebellum years through maybe, I don't know, World War I, maybe World War II, like what, just that world of these societies, because that's something that I feel like is not as prevalent,
Mhm.
maybe not quite as important in Black community right now.
Yeah, yeah, I think the world of societies are really important, and I think especially with in the COVID moment, and as particularly after the post-COVID moment, that we are seeing, Black women continuing to do the same kinds of things that they have done for such a long time, and that, of course, is representative of the fact that there are still certain barriers that have persisted over time. And so African American women have adapted those, effective kinds of practices, from the antebellum period up to the present. And so these societies are really about African American women banding together, privileging collective efforts over more individualistic accumulation. That's not to say that African American women, aren't self-interested, that they don't want to make money while they, do good. But African American women have always, understood that one of the most effective ways for them to work around these racist and sexist, these inequities and these exclusionary barriers in society is for them to band together. And so in these societies, these were also really important because these were places away from the white gaze. These were places where African Americans were in their own spaces and working together away from the surveillance and the kind of the reach and arm of the state and of whites. And certainly part of how we know how powerful and influential these societies were is because of, even in antebellum times and after Reconstruction, the kinds of laws that were passed to try to discourage and undermine these kinds of institutions is one kind of reflection of the power and influence that they had. In addition, the kind of repression that was used against African American women, the economic repression, the threat of racial sexual violence, were things that they were important kinds of issues that they discussed and they tried to work through and create solutions for within these societies. But the fact that they continue to be victims of economic repression and other forms of violence, one, heightened the need for these type of organizations, but it also then just reveals the incredible odds that African American women faced in so many areas of their lives, in their family, in terms of gaining education, in terms of gaining access to civil rights and building their communities. And so these societies, I think are really important. And I would just also add that one of the reasons that I think we see, I wouldn't call it a resurgence, but a kind of new wave of these kinds of organizations. There's the mutual aid, kind of movement that's going on now to deal with, for example, issues with mass incarceration, because this is a serious issue that so many families face. And these kinds of efforts highlight the failures of government to deal with the kinds of pressing issues and the priorities that are important to Black women as they turn their attention toward their communities and their families. And so on the one hand, their efforts are a critique, of the failures of government and society, at the same time that they are a statement that, we're not going to wait for you to respond. We are going to make demands and force you to reckon with those demands. And so these societies also are a way to really highlight, women as power brokers and a political culture. And I think especially when young people talk about, why should I vote and what's the importance of voting? I'm not going to get into that debate, but I will say that these, women banding together, whether it be these odd name societies like the Sisters of the Mysterious 10 or the Independent Order of St. Luke, which is what I look at, or today when you have Buy From a Black Woman, which is an organization of women banding together to provide marketing information, to share resources because of the lack of support that they're getting in outside societies, that these also show this kind of rich political culture of African American women, of which economic justice is, really central.
This makes me think about something that happened yesterday. So we had a panel, we had a roundtable on Black economic freedom, and there was a Black woman entrepreneur on the panel who said that she doesn't seem to know any Black run business thing. That she didn't specify by gender, but she did say she doesn't know any today that do not also have a social justice dimension to what the work that they're doing also. So these things kind of tied up. It's not strictly just an economic calculus about why they're doing the work, but there's also sort of a social change and social justice dimension to the work that they do also. And I think to your point, it's not they don't want to make money, but they also have, they have multiple goals, right? And they can do both of them. This also makes me think about something that comes up in your book, which is that the women who you discuss, and Walker in particular, and we should have you say some more about Walker in particular, really didn't, they worked with people of a variety of classes, right? And so there was an interest in, they weren't just going for the upper class, the people that had a lot of wealth already, but they were, people could come in with small levels, and this was actually how they built up the work that they were doing. So can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I think it's really important. That's why I think Magdalena Walker is so important. And that's also why in my book that I tried to do a couple of things. First of all, she is an exceptional woman. I mean, as historians, we're supposed to try to be, kind of objective, but there is just no denying the fact that Magdalena Walker was exceptional in her vision, in her work ethic. And so for me, though, I knew that it was important to also look at the world the way that Magdalena Walker looked at it. And she often, in her speeches, in her letters, in her correspondence, in her life, the way she lived her life, she always gave credit to the circle of women around her. She always talked about the importance of her mother, her community, the women that came before her, the women that would come after her, and the women around with which she worked. And so Magdalena Walker, kind of had her feet in both worlds. She was born, an enslaved woman to an enslaved little girl to an enslaved woman. And I spend a lot of time in the book talking about her mother, because I think that her mother was a really important influence on her as well as her community. So that's also another thing that I really try to do in Banking on Freedom, is to not just talk about Magdalena Walker as exceptional, but as really a reflection of her community, not an exception to it, but kind of her community made her the kind of person that she is. And so she grew up poor, but her mother but her mother really valued education, and her mother was very involved in the Independent Order of St. Luke. So Magdalena Walker cut her teeth. Her mother was a washerwoman, so she often said, I grew up with a wash bucket, wash basket on my head, not with the silver spoon, in her mouth. And so I think that upbringing and seeing how hard her mother worked, but also seeing how effective the networks that her mother was involved in, particularly the St. Luke's, that she saw that determined women with a vision and an intention could really make things happen. And so when she became a young woman, I think she became the fulfillment of her mother's, dreams. She became a teacher, which was, the highest kind of achievement, one of the highest achievements that Black women, could achieve at that time. Magdalena Walker married into a wealthy, elite Black family, the Walker family. But she never, I think, forgot the lessons that she learned from her mother. And so that is why she chose a life of work and service and commitment, instead of one of, you know, teas and, social parties, which was a life that she easily could have chosen as the wife of someone who was very elite. And so that is why the St. Luke Bank was focused on working class women, domestics, factory workers, washer women, as well as other professional women. So Magdalena Walker was in really visionary in linking together women and people of all class, different classes and different backgrounds.
Yeah, that really comes through in the book. And I even see that there seem to be some antecedents to that, meaning that even when you describe what happened, I think it's the first chapter, maybe the chapter after the introduction, but the chapter where we learn about the Freedmen's Bank. You see also that people at at working class levels, if you were, I'm not sure how actually to classify them, but people without a lot of means are still working, are still engaging financially, I think to your point before. And so, do you want to talk a little bit about the St. Luke's Bank, which is the only bank, the first and the only bank run by Black women in this country? And then can you also tell us a little bit about why Richmond?
Okay, yes. So I'll actually start with why Richmond. So
Okay.
Richmond, I mean, really deserves its place or its distinction as the cradle of Black capitalism. And that was no accident. Part of it has to do with the nature of slavery at the time in Richmond. It had one of the most diverse kinds of systems of different kinds of slavery there. So of course you have tobacco, so you have agricultural, but they also had industrial slavery. So you had African Americans who were working in fields, but also in factories and in mines and foundries, as well as mills and textile, working, around in textile factories. So what that meant was that you had so many enslavers would lease out their enslaved people to these factories and to these different industries. And African American women, African American people were able to kind of get a foothold and negotiate some benefits for themselves. So in exchange for, of course, most of the money that they earned went to the enslaver, but some really smart ones were able to negotiate terms to get a little bit of that money for themselves. Also, these people tended to live in the city. They lived in Richmond, so you had this enslaved population that had a kind of freedom because they were working in these different industries, and so they needed places to live. And so they built communities, and in those communities they built institutions. So they started schools and they started churches, but they also started businesses and other kinds of services to help this growing group of mostly enslaved, some free Black people who were engaged in all these different industries and all these different kinds of activities. So when freedom comes, after the Civil War, when the Civil War ends slavery, I'll say that. So Richmond is already primed as a place where you have African Americans who already have really established communities, who already have really strong established institutions, and who have already strong kind of business class or enterprising class of people who have banded together to try to provide goods and services, for these African Americans. So that's why in Richmond you have, in terms particularly of finance, you have the very first formal insurance company chartered and started in Richmond, the very first bank chartered and started in Richmond. That's definitely no accident. So Magdalena Walker too is coming of age not only in these communities, these well-established communities that have these long history of taking care of themselves, of making do for themselves, of self-determination and self-help. And but she does see that there is a need for services that are specifically directed toward Black women, that really center the important roles that Black women play in their families. So there are other banks in Richmond. There are, there's the True Reformers Bank, and at one point there are 3 banks in Richmond. But she recognizes that African American women need services that are really geared toward their needs and that's attentive to their schedules and their work lives and their priorities. And so when she takes over the Independent Order of St. Luke in 1899, it takes her a while to kind of build the organization back up. But in 1901, she is a pivotal moment. She gives the kind of this bold vision. She presents it to the members. She says, let us have a bank. And she also says, let us have a factory, let us have, a newspaper. But she definitely says, let us have a bank. Let us bring together the money of all the good women here. Let's turn those dimes and nickels into dollars. And it takes her a couple of years because she's also building the Independent Order of St. Luke. But in 1903, she opens the bank, a bank that is organized, largely by Black women, financed pretty almost exclusively by Black women, and of course, led by a Black woman. She becomes the first Black woman bank president. And the bank, one of the reasons that I believe that it is able to last all the way up to 2013, the subprime mortgage, crisis pretty much kills it, is because its foundation lay in responding to the needs of this really critical community, which is Black women.
Mhm. We have a question from the audience, and maybe you can address it. Someone who actually is from the area said, I attend the AME church, which is in the next block of the St. Luke Bank. Why do you think the women who worked and learned from Mrs. Walker did not continue to grow the St. Luke Bank after her death?
Well, they actually did. So so when she died in 1934, so she died in the early years of the Great Depression. And also, the testament, well, the bank changed its name from St. Luke's to Consolidated because that name represented what the bank had become. So that bank was strong, and of course we know that it was one of the very few, like less than a dozen African American banks survived the Great Depression, and the St. Luke's, well, Consolidated Bank and Trust was one of those. But she saw the two remaining Black banks in Richmond were suffering. She also recognized that white bankers were looking to try to make incursion into Jackson Ward to try to take over some of the banking and lending services in that community. So with her foresight, she, approached the other two struggling banks and told them, let us consolidate, let us put our resources together. But St. Luke was, certainly the strongest of those banks. And so Consolidated Bank and Trust, even though it shared the St. Luke name, it was a response to the consolidation of these particular banks. And the organization continued strong through the 30s, through the 40s, and 60s, and even to the 70s. And so part of the reasons have to do with some common problems that affect organizations. You have older people who get older, and you don't have as many younger people coming into these organizations. So that's part of the reason that it began to kind of falter, especially around the 60s and the 70s. But I also want to stress that outside forces also had a great deal to do with undermining these kinds of independent Black organizations and the strength and vitality of Black Wall Streets, like Jackson Ward. So slum clearance, highway programs that cut through the heart of Jackson Ward, with the intention of disrupting and uprooting Black families, destroying and closing Black businesses, were the kinds of depredations, but I don't like to use big words. Those were the kinds of attacks from the outside that very few organizations would be able to survive. And so I just want to really stress that in terms of the St. Luke, it did continue to be a vital organization that continued to do, good things and good works in the community. But the main thing that undermined it were these outside efforts, which were definitely pointed in the direction of destroying these symbols of Black economic progress.
One of the things that I mean, obviously Walker is, as you put it, is a phenomenal person. But one of the other things that I really liked about the book as well is it focused on a time period with in depth that I'm not as familiar with, and it's this period where Jim Crow is metastasizing but has not fully formed, and so a lot of times we think about the fight that Black people led to end Jim Crow, but there's also the fight that Black people led to try to stop it from starting. And so in the book, you talk a little bit about the boycott of I think it's transportation and enrichment. So if you just talk a little bit about that, and also the fact that Walker played a role in that, was also kind of the roles that these people who are in one hand they're running a business, but they're also this community leader, and just kind of bring us into that time period and how unique and different it was in that time.
Yeah. Well, I'll actually go back a little bit, because another point that I really try to make about the Freedmen's Bank is that when the Freedmen's Bank closed in 1874, through no fault of the Black people who pumped billions of dollars through that bank, but totally because of the mismanagement and abuse of the all-white trustees of that bank, the fact that African Americans never stopped, well, for decades, continued to demand their refunds from those banks. So even those small amounts of money, $5, less than $20, African Americans, even 50 years later, were demanding from the federal government, what did we want, this investment, from our people. I talk about like Matilda Scott. She says, who did you give my money to? What did you do with my mom's, $18? And she was saying that in 1920. So I just want to say that just shows the kind of radical tradition that continued to percolate and build in African American communities around economic issues. So these demands for refunds from the bank stand right alongside these kinds of boycotts and other kinds of demands, like reparations, ex-slave pensions, etc. So these boycotts continue in this radical tradition of African Americans demanding not just civil and social rights, but also economic rights. And so you're right that this is a period you have the end of slavery. And since you don't have that formal institution that marks Black people as slave and white people as free, which is the assumption that is always made, white Americans need to institute laws and practices in order to reinscribe or try to reinscribe on African Americans that second class status. So they do begin with Jim Crow. And I always like to stress that Jim Crow is both laws, but also these cultural practices that buttress these laws. And so that's why you have all these new laws coming on the books in the 1890s, in the early 1900s. First, they deal with things like disenfranchisement. So that's one of the kind of first ways they try to undercut African American progress in citizenship. And then they turn to public accommodations, trying to inscribe on African Americans, this second class status by not allowing them to sit, in streetcars next to whites, not allowing them to use the same kinds of restaurants. But that's a process that evolves. It doesn't happen all at once. Different states, began to enact these kinds of laws. So around the early 1900s is when Virginia begins to segregate public accommodations. And of course, one of the first ones they do is the streetcars. And they say that Black people, have to sit in a colored section. They have to give up their seats for whites, et cetera, et cetera. So there's the law, but then there's also this kind of social etiquette that they're of deference that they're also expecting. So people who know their Richmond history, know that you have African Americans who are, speaking out and speaking out against this, and Maggie Lena Walker is one. And one of the reasons it's really important that she, takes such a of powerful role in this movement is because this really isn't an issue that concerns her personally. I mean, she's very wealthy. She has her own, beautiful carriage. Public transportation is not, a pressing concern for her. But because her heart in her, is with the working class women that make up the Independent Order of St. Luke, and that is the kind of customer that will be the customer base for the St. Luke Bank. They really rely on public transportation. So Black women are moving from, for example, from Jackson to the areas of white areas of town to work in white people's houses. Black women are moving, and Black men too, are moving from Jackson, these Black communities, out to the factories and the industries, where they are doing their work. So for Black women, this is really an important issue, and for working class people, it's a really important issue. And so Walker uh takes the stand. She mobilizes the women of the Independent Order of St. Luke, women in her church. They have these rallies, and she and other women in the Independent Order of St. Luke, like Patsy, her good friend Patsy Keeley Anderson, they shout from the pulpit, from the dais rather, walk, don't take the streetcars, let's bring them to their knees. And then Magdalena Walker meets with the two other bank people who presidents of the bank, and they decide to fund a Black-owned transportation company. Also, Magdalena Walker is the vice president of the Richmond Negro Business League, and they empty their treasury fighting, as part of a legal fight against these Jim Crow restrictions. So Magdalena Walker is like just really important because she, even though this isn't a personal issue for her because of her class status, she understands how critically important it is for that community, and that she uses not only her platform as, because she's also the a high ranking officer in the Independent Order of St. Luke, to mobilize women all around the state, not just in Richmond, but all around the state, to fight these kinds of Jim Crow laws. She also puts her money where her mouth is to make sure that, they fight, legally, that they fund the legal fight, but then that they also get creative and decide, well, you know what, we'll just create a Black-owned transportation company. And they do almost bring the company to its knees, but after a couple of years, the boycott kind of peters out, and African Americans have very little choice but to kind of follow the Jim Crow laws, but they never stop fighting, those laws, and looking for ways around having to deal with the demeaning practices of Jim Crow.
Yeah. We have another question from the audience. We actually have a few that are coming in. One person references how you talked about the outside factors that contributed to the downfall of Black Wall Streets. And so the person wants to know, which of these policies do you think contribute the most to the wealth and capital gap that persists today? Thoughts on that?
Oh, you know, I will just pick one, but this is just like what's just so insidious about white supremacy and anti-blackness and and racism, is that You know, it's not just the one thing, it's that kind of old interlocking power that they reinforce each other in ways to undermine the communities. For me, at first I was going to say slum clearance, and that's because I'm really kind of thinking about slum clearance because that is where they actually would destroy, you know, Black housing stock, claiming that, you know, it's inhabitable, it's dilapidated. Um, but of course, completely ignoring how the lack of city services and redlining created, you know, these um, uh, these issues in these neighborhoods. And instead of replacing that housing stock with single family homes, they tended to, you know, add to do multifamily, you know, projects, those kinds of buildings. So I was going to say that at first, but I think I have to go with the highway system. And I think I want to say the highway system because these the cities in the states and the federal government too, they use eminent domain to just take, you know, land, people's property, their homes, to just take it and to give them almost, you know, pennies on the dollar in terms of the value. And then they build these, you know, highways, you know, multi, you know, lane highways in ways that really you know, destroy, you know, these communities by dissecting them and cutting them up in such a way that you know, it just destroys the integrity of the neighborhood. But also I think I'll pick the highways is because of what they stand for. These were highways built to allow especially whites to move out of these kind of inner city, central city areas out to the suburbs. So I see them as kind of really a multiple slap in the face, because one, they just stole, you know, the land and value from African Americans. Then they, you know, proceeded to destroy, you know, neighborhoods and communities. And then they were not even made with them in mind. They were made to move, you know, capital and political power and, you know, good neighborhoods and great community services to away from those, further away from those communities into the suburbs. So if I had to pick one, I'm gonna go with the highway system.
Well, and of course, that's still a deep wound here in Durham, North Carolina, as I'm sure you're
Yep,
aware of. So that's the
yep.
first thing that comes to mind.
Yep.
Those of us who are here
Yeah.
can relate to that. I actually wanted to
Mhm.
ask you, as a historian, you know, the book is really well written. It's really a great read. And we get to learn about people almost as characters. I mean, we really get the full flavor of their lives. And so I'd love for you to tell us how, as a historian, you construct those lives. What is your process like for those of us who are not in your field?
Mhm. Well, the first thing I would say is that I know most people, first of all, most people, especially when I, you know, talk to my students, they kind of like, well, especially when they're students, they don't too much like history. You know, it's a whole bunch of dates and rivers and stuff like, and I sometimes say like one damn thing after another. So most people don't really like history, and I think part of the reason is because of the way that history is taught. You know, that it is, you know, these dates and not telling stories and how and bringing in people's personalities so that people can see how they relate to people in the past, how they face the same kinds of challenges and the same kinds of questions, and sometimes the same kinds of choices. And so these historical people can kind of sometimes give us a little lessons about, you know, why things are the way they are in the present. But also because so many things are like so disconnected. You know, one period you think that, you know, for example, when say depression, the Great Depression starts in 1929, with the stock market crash, and it's over, at a very specific time, or the civil rights movement starts on a particular day at a particular time. And so I think that's part of some things that people don't like about history. And so I would say that for us as historians, especially for me, it's really important for me to make connections, to really try to help people see not just change over time, but how the kinds of challenges that people faced in one particular period can follow, them into another generation, how those same kind of problems or issues look different in different, time periods and different spaces. So it's really, for me, it's important about making connections, and stories are one way to make those kinds of connections. But at the same time, I have to admit that if you want to tell a story about poor working class people, that's a hard story to tell, because poor working class people don't often leave the kinds of sources that we rely on to the raw materials of history, letters, diaries, yes, even for Black businesses, business records. So the kinds of things that we try to depend on to tell these kind of stories are sometimes really hard to find when it comes to working class people. So we have to get really creative. Sometimes we have to get really creative, which is like one of the things that I did in the book to try to recover the life of Magdalena Walker's mom. She was she didn't know how to, she never learned how to read or write. So she didn't leave a letter or any kind of testimony about what happened to her as a young woman. And so I had to piece together, little fragments in the archive and in the record to try to imagine what her life was like. And so but this is different than just telling a story. I did, grounded in the experiences of other women, of what, kinds of things that were going on at that time, other kinds of information that I had, to just try to pull this story out of the dark, spaces, of history. And then you also have to be creative because with the sources, because a lot of the material that we have about African Americans is mediated, we say, is told through non-Black people. So, the ways that we know about some of the things that African Americans are doing, especially when I talk about Reconstruction, what happens after the Civil War, is pretty much when I know that whites are complaining about these, rowdy, uppity, ignorant, et cetera, Negroes, then that's a clue for me that, oh, Black people are doing something. They're organizing. They're doing things that are making the power structure really uncomfortable. And so I would just end by saying that that's also a really good tool for trying to figure out how to make sense of all this information that we have now. So sometimes when you read news stories or hear headlines about, especially when we think about, police murders of unarmed Black people, and we begin to hear stories about, the threats, of certain people, when people are talking about African Americans being in places and doing things and saying things that they shouldn't, then that always is a clue to say, well, what's another way to see this? How can I look into this deeper? How can I get more information? Because typically, if the powers that be are complaining, that means that people are pushing against boundaries, that they're disrupting power. And so those kinds of tools of telling history are important for us to understand the past, but also to understand our present.
Mhm, mhm.
One of the things I also really appreciated is that contextualization. So some of the non-main characters in here, one, Caroline Dye, who's this kind of spiritualist who made his career. I mean, it's just a few paragraphs there, but this amazing person who existed, who created, anyway, she's, if you read the book, so you can just get a sense of her. But another person who I think speaks to what you just said, which is a person who existed in this time period, but speaks directly to a lot of the conversations we're having now, and that's Marianne Prout, who's one of the influences on Miss Walker. And there's just one line in here, but it says, that her brothers, Prout's brothers, William and Jacob, immigrated to Liberia and became prominent leaders there. And Prout remained in Baltimore. So it's this cool, African diasporic connection between people who went off on two different continents to play leadership roles and then, impacted generations of people. And, here we are today, like we had a panel yesterday that Carla mentioned, where we're talking about diasporic investment between Africa and African Americans. And I think part of the reason why we don't see those connections is because there's not enough of people like yourself who are elevating these stories. As difficult as it may be to piece them together, there's just so few of these stories in books written to say, well, actually, people have been struggling doing this fight for a long time. And then one last piece I'll mention. I've memorized now, the hand that rocks the cradle rules the world. I mean, these are like some amazing women. I mean, it's like it just to read it, like it's really, it's not really a question, but it's really great to be able just to be in that time and hear about these people doing amazing things 100 plus years ago.
Yeah, I would just, I'm sorry.
Oh, no, you go ahead.
Oh, I would just stress too that so often in my classes, I students always talk about, man, I never heard this before. How come I don't know about these people? And I also teach a Mississippi history, a history of Black Mississippians, and so a lot of my students are from Mississippi, and they're learning things about Oxford, where we are now, or their hometowns that they have never heard of before. So I would say especially when we're talking about history, is that it's not an accident, that these kinds of stories are so hidden. Part of it has to do, with the sources. Part of it has to be with the people who, have been telling the stories for a long time. So that's why, it's important for people, like me, and for forums like this to bring these stories to the fore. Also, I like a book of that where you can, go into a little rabbit hole every now and then. So you could look up Carolyn Dye, and you would learn that she never charged for her services, and she never would have called herself a spiritualist, even though that's what she was. She was just a woman who talked to God, and that God could tell her things about you. And that's why, powerful white politicians from all over the country would come to her little town in Arkansas to be read by her. And but she never charged, but they would give her money. And they said that when she passed away, there was like $100,000 in bills stuffed in, books and bookcases and under cushions, just all throughout her house. And she was able to buy her own home, to buy land. And so I also bring her up too, because I'm talking about this kind of world of credit that beyond banking that African Americans had to depend on. So gambling, loan sharks, pawn shops, those were the kinds of choices that African Americans had at that time. And I definitely wanted to stress those. And then one thing I say about Marianne Prout too is that, she too, I think, has a legacy. As I came across this group called Black Women Build, and they have a Black Women Build Baltimore. And I so see Mary Prout in that. And this is a group of women who are banded together to teach women how to build houses, to get into construction. And they build homes and give them away, to people. And so I totally see the spirit of women like Mary Prout, who influenced a woman like Maggie Lena Walker, who is still influencing, women, 100 years later. As again, important about the importance of when you have Black women, in a space.
We're already out of time, which is really too bad, because there's obviously so much more we want to talk about. And I'm apologize to those of you who've been writing questions in the chat and we haven't been able to get to them. This has been a really great conversation.
They can email me.
Okay.
So, I mean, if you just Google my name, you'll find my address,
All right, because there
and
are
you can
actually
email
some
me
great
your
questions
question.
in the Q&A. And there is one question about where to buy the book. And if you go to our website where for the Black Communities Conference, we have a link to the book, as well as in the daily emails that you're receiving. You should have a link to the book also, so you can purchase it there. Thank you so much. We really enjoyed this. We'd love to stay in touch, and we really encourage everybody to read the book. All right, take
Thank
care
you.
and head to our next session.